Alright guys, hi and welcome to HEMAchat. As always, I am Ted, and with me is my eternal partner,
Seiji.
Yeah, great. So this week we are going to start off talking about last week, our interpretation of the circle. Got some questions, and I got to say before we get into the questions, because we're going to answer those today and talk about our reasoning for it, I love it, right? One of the biggest problems I find, and I think Seiji will agree with me on this, is when interpreting any kind of techniques in HEMA, there is the fear of the echo chamber. That is to say that we all start to kind of parrot each other. We start to do the same thing every single time. We get a lot of yes men, right? And so that's like a big fear. If you're in a club and you don't have somebody challenging your interpretations, you can easily go down some unfortunate paths, I think, right? Like you've probably had this a couple of times. Any notable, examples for yourself where you got stuck in a hole?
Yeah. Well, I cannot think of myself, but maybe John Clemens. Perhaps.
Oh, okay.
Clemens,
Okay,
yeah.
so without, let's just say JC, right, without throwing stones or talking about any other groups, there is a certain group which shall remain nameless at the moment, but yeah, they have kind of a reputation, a certain Mr. JC, for going down his rabbit hole and sticking with his interpretations. And because they don't talk to people outside of the HEMA community, they run into, or I should say outside of their own internal insular community, we sometimes laugh at some of the interpretations they get, flat about strong, if you will, right? Yeah, one of the classic ones. So, we're going to talk then a little bit about this. So the first thing that I wanted to look at was the question from Thomas Carrillo. Now, if you guys aren't following Thomas on YouTube, you should probably start. Thomas runs the Fresno Fry Factor, so he's a great one to bug us for questions. He's another one of our local, here in California, Fry Factor groups, and Thomas, is great for coming in and asking questions. So Thomas asked a question in 4 or 5 parts. The first part being, why does Meyer-Zedel say, let the circle connect to the right, if the circle connects to both sides? That is an excellent question. And the answer is Meyer actually has, some plays where it does connect to the left, which leads us to his second question. Can we give him a unambiguous example of a circle? He said to the opponent's right. I think he meant to the opponent's left in the text. So I'm going to give you both of those things, right? We're going to look at both of those and kind of give examples on each of those. So the first one that we're going to start with is this one. This is from 1.53v2. In the onset, when you're almost in range of him, then act as if you intend to deliver a long, strong Oberhau. When he goes up to meet you, then turn the short edge in the air from your right against his left and jerk your pommel upward. Strike him with the short edge over his arm or hands. Step well to his left side. Let it run around past in a circle and cut long after his nearest openings or attack with Unterhau. So right there we have an example of a attack being done to his left, right? As we strike in with our Zornhau, just as the swords are about to connect or right as they come to get there, we're immediately turning it into the circle to strike around. We'll jump over and show kind of that in a minute. But that was kind of to answer Thomas's first question. Is there an unambiguous? I find that one to be pretty unambiguous. Clearly a strike at the left side of the opponent. So, good times. I hope Thomas likes that. Now, going on from there, Thomas asked, if the circle is done from the bind, why does Meyer have both combatants pull up away from the bind in his examples in the chapter? He also talks about the one in the middle guard. So that was probably unclear of me in the video last week. I don't think that the circle is only done from the bind, but rather that it is very often done from the bind. There are absolutely examples of it where it's not. Just in our interpretation, usually when we're teaching it, we teach it from the bind, and it helps to kind of distinguish it separately from Ablaufen, which we try and teach without contact, even though there are examples of Ablaufen that are done with contact. But to answer your question, Thomas, specifically about that next portion of it, we have the first part. I actually disagree with you in the very beginning here that it's done out of the bind. Now, we've looked at this, right? This is the first example of the circle, 1.20v and 1.20v1 is the specific play. Cut through from above with the short edge, crossed hands past his right side. Nowhere in there are we told to leave the bind. Meyer's told us that we've come into the bind and that we have the swords overhead in the air, and that we're going to do this when we have the opportunity or when we can pull it off, but we're not specifically leaving the bind in this example. Now, for this one, actually, I actually really like another play. This is 149v3. Again, a lot of this stuff is going to come from the third part of the longsword for Meyer. So, an opponent, this comes in from above. Opponent has cut at you from above as before. Then we're going to cut from our left, from below, against his stroke. And we catch his overhow up in the air, so we have our sword already with crossed hands. And then as soon as it clashes, we're going to do the circle, again now targeting his right ear. And we'll then do this quickly after the blades connect with the short edge down from above. So there is an example where we've come into the bind on the left and we're going to do this cross. I actually think, based on how Meyer tells us repeatedly earlier on, that this is how a lot of these plays are kind of set up. He often tells us it comes from the right, but it's an attack from above. And he's clear in several situations where he likes to cut into a bind by cutting in opposition. Particularly, he notes in Dusak that you have the bogan, which is the kind of the parry from below. The same thing as Hangentort in longsword. So we're cutting back up to parry. He says the same thing earlier in the section on the basic cuts, where he talks about you've cut down from above, now you're going to go with cross hands up to parry that cut, and that's the bind that we're setting up in. And if we put in context of provoker, taker, hitter, we have a provoking overhow that brings us down into a low guard. We immediately then have an attack in Knockreisen coming at our head. So we come back up and parry with crossed hands from below, puts us in this bind on the left side of their sword. Excuse me, we're on the left, right side of their sword. Yeah, they're on the right. We're on their right. And then we can do the play from there. So using, kind of those elements, I still kind of stick to this idea that the circle is being done, in this case, not by coming out of the bind and striking around, but we've already ended up in a bind that is going to be advantageous. And so we have both a right side and a left side option for this one. There was another one that I have as kind of continuing on of that answer to Thomas as well. And Thomas, I see you there in chat. Absolutely, always give you a good shout out. Again, guys, go watch Thomas's channel. Give him some subscribers. We'll put a link to it in the description of the video at the end so that you can get onto his channel as well. So, cuts at you from above is the same time. This one, I should note for this particular play, 135R3, a little bit earlier, this is right from the middle of the play. So he cuts from above at the same time. We're going to pull quickly back around once the swords have hit and strike with the inside flat opposite to it, deep at his upper right opening. Such your hands come crosswise. At once pull back as if you intend to cut at his left. However, do not do this, but pull back away before this and cut with the short edge in a circle at his right ear. Now, here is absolutely a circle not being done from a bind. We have provoked a bit of an opening. And once again, we're sitting with crossed hands already. So we're kind of setting up in the same kind of scenario where we don't have to get into really weird situations. We've come up with the flat. We've kind of flicked around to the other side. Right, we've come up with flat, we've kind of flicked, but we've come right back in with a circle, and there we have it. So, yeah. The last question Thomas had was, you implied the HEMA were wrong for being so close. Meyer says the circle is done with both of you have your swords overhead in the air. Would you describe your setup as being overhead in the air? In the video that we did, no. We were, kind of setting up sometimes for our framing of our shots, and so we don't always go high. Having said that, I do this sometimes from the lower guards to teach it, because I found that that's easier for people initially, and then we go higher. We'll switch over to the other camera here, and we'll look at it as well for how we've got into some of the higher binds for this. Notably, cutting up from below, we end up with our hands over our head and are able to pull this off the way that we want. I got one last answer for Thomas also that I had set up for this, so let's just look at it here. 153R1. So opponent changes through to your right side from your shield how, right? So I'm throwing a shield how. They change through. So I then immediately am going to switch to a shield on my right, the new shield right. So again, turn the long edge against its blade, let your pommel go through under your right arm, step with your left foot well to his right side. So what's happened? We've shield howed, he's done Durchwechseln, we've changed our long edge onto it, and now we're coming at it with the shield how on the other side, right? So he's changed through in vain, and now we're once again in a position where we're bound with crossed hands, so we can let it run off at his right side using the circle and deliver a Zwerk to his left ear. So again, this one's not necessarily up super high when we're pulling it off. If he's changed through underneath, I was a certain amount of height, but I have to drop down to get to him. And so we're going to, let's look at a couple of those plays right now. And so we'll just kind of see how it looks. And we're going to stay on our non-action camera here just so we don't have to move around a whole bunch for you guys while we're doing this. So first, thank you, Seiji. Let's start, since we're kind of looking at the upper openings. Go ahead and be on this side. I'm going to strike through from above, and Seiji's going to attack at my head, so I'll come up and catch. So there we go. I definitely got a bind. Swords are above my head. Now I can get that circle, aim it in his right ear, he sets it off, and then if I step in, as Meyer tells us to do with my right foot to his right side, striking his head, I actually close off the line really well if Seiji tries to strike back in. I have a nice strike at his head as I come in. So one more time, right? We're going to come in, he's going to catch him, we're going to catch, we'll circle with it, aiming at his ear, keep the hands high, strike to the head, or step back even to clear distance. And there we have it. So that'll give us the nice high one. Now, for the shield how, if I go to shield, right, I'm going to throw my shield and he changes through underneath of it. Why? There's my bind, circle, reach for it, and strike. Or, let's do it exactly as the text says, right? So I'm going to strike in, he's going to change, wind it out, reach for it, and strike with my Zwerk right around. So we can do it hands high, we can do it hands low. I think specifically why Meyer's telling us let it circle to the right and keep your hands high is that it actually works much more deceptively. Also, if their sword is up, Seiji, if his sword is up high, I want to keep my hands high and I don't want to drop, because if I do drop, I'm going to get struck in the head. But if I keep the hands high and do it, I keep myself protected. If he then starts to slice it off, I finish it. So I don't want to drop it when there's a sword above my head. Keep your hands high, connect to the right, works with what he's talking about. So, Thomas, I see you're there in chat. I hope that answers questions. If you have any more, go ahead and fire them off, and we'll get to them here in just a second as we go through and look at what we're going to talk about for the rest. How are we doing for time? We're doing good. Seiji, do you have anything to add?
Should we do Durchwechseln one more time, because I might have been out of.
Sure. Let's see. So, I apologize, guys. Our backup cameraman is not here today to make sure we're in frame. So right. So I'm going to strike at you with shield house, so don't already be in it. Right. We'll just go ahead and throw. Well, be in flute. Let's do flute. Okay. So you're going to go to Durchwechseln, wind it, reach for it, set it aside, strike, or strike, wind, shoot, pop. Take my step. Strike, wind, reach, pop, and then strike. Okay? Hopefully I was in frame that time. Okay? Anything else to add? Right?
So,
yeah.
So the question, you mentioned a lot of crossed hands, but when you do the circle, do you only do the crossed hands if you bound from the left, or what about if you bound from the right? Is that where you would do a circle with uncrossed hands?
Right. So this is for me, and this is extrapolating, right? Let me make this very, very clear up front. I am at this point extrapolating on what Meyer has told us, and I don't necessarily have direct translations of that, although I think I do. Having said that, it's there. I'm looking actually right at it. As I say, I don't have it. I'm looking at the one that I was looking at, that's specifically the attack at his left side. The uncrossed hands, if I've struck in and bound from my right side, I'm not going to try and do this with crossed hands. At that point, now I'm doing doubliere, right? If I've struck in here and I'm reaching across to strike in, I'm basically in a doubliere situation, okay? On the other hand, that same action, coming through, striking, pulls the parry, hits the head, or finish it however we want. So I think in the longsword especially, that the circle, if we follow Meyer's provoker taker hitter, and we've started with a provoking cut that maybe missed, and we're setting up for knock Ryson, right? I think there's enough evidence in the book that this is something that happens normally, and we strike back, we'll be set up in a situation where we already are in a bind with crossed hands, whether it's from the new Schielhau, whether it's by parrying from below. I think Meyer gets into that position quite a large amount, and so we do it with crossed hands. For ourselves, because we often end up in the bind with uncrossed hands, I think it makes more sense unless we're doing something to particularly pull an action that'll make it safe otherwise. Okay? All right, so I think what we'll do then, guys, is we're going to move on to our technique for this week. If you do have any questions, go ahead and hit them there in chat. Otherwise, as always, ask them down in comments, guys, and we are more than happy to come back and talk about a particular topic ad nauseum. We'll argue about it week on end. That's one of the things that makes HEMA amazing, is the fact that, you know, there is no way to know, but as long as we continue to have this dialogue with each other and explore ideas, I think we're in good shape for what we're going to do. So we're going to move over, and this week we're going to be looking at the reversing from Meyer as well, the Verkehren, and so we're going to talk about some of the elements of that. And yes, Seiji, absolutely get your mask on. All right, so hopefully... Good. Sorry, I had to check my audio really quick there, guys. Seiji, just a little bit to the right of it, to the side of the door there, a little bit forward. There we go. All right, so we're going to talk about the reversing this week. Now, the reversing is an action that absolutely happens from a bind. Meyer tells us that we've struck into the bind and that we're going to reverse by sticking our right hand, or our left hand under our right and go from there, which is great. But what exactly does he mean by that? Also, Meyer does mention to take the head out of the way. So the way we do reversing is going to, once again, be an action from a bind. And in this case, it's a bind where the person is giving us a bit of pressure. Typically a neutral bind, although we're going to get into a little bit of extrapolation here and some of the different things that we do for a variety of reasons. So the first, Seiji, actually stand right there. Right there. We'll get a bit of an angle on this. Okay? So we strike in to a neutral bind, right? So we're in a neutral Spreckfenster bind. Right? Looking over there, I feel in the bind, I strike in and I remain for a second, and I feel that Seiji is giving me a bit of pressure, okay? So I want to reverse. Now, if I just reverse underneath, there's a very real probability that this is coming right at my face, okay? Conveniently, though, in the description of the play, let me turn that around and check what the question is. In the description of the play, Meyer specifically tells us to take our head well out of the way when we do this, right? So I feel the pressure, I'm going to take my head out of the way because that's where it's coming at, and then drive down, okay? So I can do this. Now, we talk about here at the school, and you can blame Rob Rutherford for this, on different types of bind, of an overbind or not having an overbind. Meyer does this, doesn't really talk about this, but this is something we get from Robert. When I strike in to this neutral bind, if I just do this with the long edge, yeah, I absolutely have this point right in my face. Now, again, I can pull the face out of the way. We often do this one here at the school because there are a couple of spots where Meyer describes this by taking it to the short edge first so that we more rapidly gather this onto our strong, who's weak onto our strong, and then drive it down. And it really comes to a question of, do I have an overbind or do I not have an overbind? I'm going to turn this a little bit since you're not talking, Seiji. So hopefully that fixes the audio a little bit better for you guys. So do I have an overbind? If I do, then I'm going to use the long edge. If I don't, then I'm going to use the short edge. And again, it comes back to, as I strike in at Seiji, I want to drive, I'll do this slower, strike in, don't have an overbind, reverse to the short edge as I'm driving through, pulls him onto my strong, so I can put it out of the way. Now, is this exactly as Meyer said? No, right? Again, Meyer's version of this, as we've struck into the bind, is pull your head out of the way and drive it forward. At the end of the day, right, this is one of those situations where we have to make a decision on how we're going to do it. I think they both work. I think that the short edge in this situation is a little bit safer if we pull it off properly because we're getting on top and we're getting him gathered, right, as quickly as possible there so So his pressure comes down, it's going to hit my schilt or it's going to hit my cross, and then I'm going to drive it to the ground. But if I want to do it with the long edge, I can. I just have to make sure to really get that head out of the way. The question, though, starts to be, is it a crump or is it a reversing? And the answer is yes, right? The reversing is kind of the crump after the fact, right? I've struck in, and then I'm going through, pulling the head out of the way, drive it down, versus striking in immediately in a crump position and driving it down. Ultimately, though, for this technique, I find the short edge version, even though it's not textbook for what Meyer tells us, works better because of that gathering action that occurs, right? Strike in, turn it, and immediately go, right? As soon as we feel pressure, as soon as I've struck in, I feel Seiji's pushing hard, turn, drive. Puts me in a really, really strong situation. I can do it the other way, but I gotta be careful that I pull that head out of the way and really lean, or I'm gonna get hit. Yes?
I got a question here. What's the difference in your opinion between Zirckel
Uh-huh.
and Ausreißen?
So between Zirckel and Ausreißen. So the Ausreißen is the wrenching. I would say it comes, how to put this? Zirckel is a motion that I do with my hands and my sword to get into an advantageous position. Ausreißen is an action that I use on his sword to control and move it out of the way. I'm trying to think how to explain this. It's not a noun-verb kind of thing, but it's almost like a passive and active action, like verb. I don't know if that makes sense. You have anything to add?
No.
You know what I'm saying?
Do it next week?
Yeah, we'll do Ausreißen next week.
That's a good one.
Because it is a good question. Typically, I think what it probably is going to be, there's no wrench inherent, right? If I turned over and I pushed to the side, I can reverse then wrench, or I can reverse then bar. I don't necessarily need to reverse to wrench, though. A perfect example occurs in, what is it? It's the second play from Zornhut, I think it is, where as he strikes in, I slip forward, and I think it has a step on this one and catch, and then I put the short edge on it. I wouldn't call this a reversing because I'm already there, but from there I can wrench to strike at his head, right? So the wrenching is an action that's focused on his sword, moving it out of the way, whereas the reversing is an action that's focused on my sword and control. I hope that makes sense. Okay? All right. Seiji, anything to add on the reversing?
Yeah, it's very important that in reversing, it's very important that a lot of times if we're observing, so his head is the other way, I see, especially with some of my students or people in general, that when they perform the reversing, that they tend to go in this window shield wiper, and if you do that, that'll make make your opponent. It'll allow your opponent to perform an Umschnappen very easily.
Right.
You have to go more diagonally forward,
Right.
kind of like a 45-degree or something like that.
When I jam that up underneath, I'm keeping my point forward, aiming past his right side. What I don't want to do is jam it to the side and come completely perpendicular to him.
If you jam it to the side, you end up wrenching his foible down onto the ground, and the foible can escape, and he can perform a Durchwechsel.
Yeah, so let's actually look, well, we actually set up for, this leads to the Sperren, to the barring, right? So we'll go slow, right? So he struck in, I'm going to reverse over, we'll do it Meyer side, move my, well out of the way. Strike, over, down. Now we're into Sperren, now we're into the barring. And it's very important, can they see can you see my swords? Okay. Sorry, guys. Back a little bit. Okay, strike, bam, reverse, drive down. So we've got his sword bar. The further back I am, the easier it is for him to potentially slip out underneath and strike. Versus, if I'm here, he's not going to come all the way around, and by the time that he does, we have a response waiting to happen. Okay? Excellent. All right. Mitch, if you can, take me back to, what is it, 7? right camera? I'm on the right camera. Excellent. All right. So our heresy this week, guys, is going to be a brief one, not necessarily a technique, but a question that comes up, and this kind of played off last week's stuff, is interpreting Meyer's plays. When we're looking at his plays, are we trying to do the entire action, right, that he describes, or are we looking for like the core component that is the action, right? So the circle, what part of the description of the circle is important for the circle? Obviously, he finishes the final cut in a variety of different ways, sometimes with a Schielhau, or excuse me, a Scheitelhau, sometimes with a Zirckel, right? So obviously that's not the core part of it. He enters into it in different ways. So we know that circling motion is what it is. And when I read the devices and when I read the various plays, that's what I'm looking for, is the core element that makes it up, right? And this is sometimes going to lead to arguments. It's not really a heresy. I know other people do this as well. But that's what I'm looking for. When I read through Meyer's descriptions, with some exceptions in the third part of the longsword, I don't necessarily expect to do the plays exactly as written. Rather, I want to learn from them, and as he notes, you know, learn what I can do. What is it? Like the first play from Ox, he notes that he's included all this extra stuff because there's a lot of good things in there that if you think about it, you can learn from. And that's what I try and take to heart on a lot of this. So sometimes on some of these descriptions, I'll try and be really, really clear when we are extrapolating from Meyer's written word and our interpretation of the core part of the technique. But I just want to put that out there, that that's going to be the case sometimes. Do we have any questions, Mitch? Otherwise, I think we're going to call it for the day. All right, guys, so thank you. We got people starting to show up for class here, so at this point, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. It has been a pleasure, as always. Please feel free to ask us questions in the comments. We'll get to them in a future video. And hit that like and subscribe button. Also, like I said, Thomas Carrillo of the Fresno Fry Factor is putting together his website, especially if you want to see Meyer Dusak. That is what Thomas specializes in, and is working through putting videos of Meyer's Dusak material up. So, you know, make sure to head over to his channel. There'll be a link down here in the description in just a second for those of you that are watching it later on. It'll be there already. And, you know, subscribe to him. Let's get him enough subscriptions that he can start to, you know, do some fun things on his channel as well. But once again, I am Ted, Seiji, and we'll see you next time. Take care. Thank you.